going to be thinking about perhaps a little overlooked concept in education, particularly in relation to metacognition, the theme of this year's Cambridge Schools conference. So I hope you've enjoyed the conference so far. I thoroughly enjoyed the keynote. And hopefully we're going to be tying together today some of the affective or perhaps emotional dimensions of thinking and the relationship between thinking and feeling that can be quite helpful, and I hope will be of use to you as practitioners working in schools. So just a little bit about my background. I'm currently finishing my PhD here at Cambridge, and my research is at the intersection of psychology and education. I work with schools, primary and secondary level here in the UK. I'm also a teacher to PhD and master's students here at the faculty. And I used to work for Cambridge International, Cambridge Assessment for 3 years actually. I had the pleasure of working across lots of different projects with different ministries from around the world. So I hope that you'll enjoy the perspective that I bring today, and I look forward to hearing your insights. Speaking of which, please say hello and tell us where you are joining us from in the world in the chat. It would be great to see the different countries that we represent in today's workshop. All right, so just a very brief overview of what I'm going to be covering today. So we're going to be thinking first about learners' mental well-being and what we mean by that. And then we're going to be making the association with learner well-being and attainment. In other words, what does well-being matter to educators? We're then going to tie together thinking about learner well-being, in particular in relation to metacognitive experiences and why it might be important to consider learners' well-being when we're thinking about metacognition. I'm then going to have the opportunity for us to explore some of these theories of metacognition and well-being as they relate to your teaching practice. So this will be where we kind of change gears in the webinar, and it will be over to you for us to collaborate and learn together about how we might apply this theory. And there'll of course be time at the end for a discussion, so the chance to ask any questions and a bit of a Q&A at the end. So let's kick off, shall we? And let's have a quick look at what we actually mean by learner well-being. Now, I recently wrote this education brief for Cambridge International, which gives an overview of how we might understand well-being. And I'm drawing upon the literature in my discipline and some of the key theories of well-being. But as you can see here, we've got a kind of wheel, a diagram which shows you the two different kind of facets, if you will, of well-being. So you can see on one side, we're thinking about feelings. So those affective experiences that we all have in our lives because we are feeling beings. And this is really drawing upon the hedonic tradition of well-being. And on the other side, we can see what is referred to as functioning. So in other words, the quality of our relationships, the extent to which we are engaged in meaningful activities, and our personal development. So together, these two experiences, how we feel in life and how we function, make up what we would refer to as our individual well-being. And of course, young people, being small adults, small microcosms of who they're going to be when they grow up, they also experience these different aspects of well-being. And in my work, I argue that school is an extremely powerful environment for actually cultivating good well-being. Something else that I underline in my work is the need to understand that well-being is a cultural construct. Now, there's a variety of different perspectives that we represent in today's webinar. Sorry that I haven't had the chance to see just yet where you're all from, but I'm looking forward to looking through the chat and seeing where we're coming from in the world. Now, in my research, I distinguish between the two different ways that we might understand well-being, given that it is such a multidimensional and cultural specific construct. So there are etic and emic approaches. In other words, there are universal ways of understanding well-being, perhaps elements of what it means to be well that are shared across continents and across countries. However, it's undeniable that there's going to be, specific cultural meaning that is given to the experience of well-being. And just to give you a bit of a flavour, some of the definitions that I've come across in my own work. So compared to my positionality here in the West, you can look across to, say, South African culture and see that actually to be well is really oriented around this idea of Ubuntu. So the idea that I am because you are. In other words, that there is an intrinsic interconnectedness between the individual and the community, the family, the friendship groups, the society in which they live. So actually their state of well-being is contingent upon how well others are in their environment. So particular emphasis there on the interpersonal element. Whereas if we look more perhaps towards China, we can see Confucianist philosophy has a huge emphasis on how well-being is understood, the emphasis being perhaps on more eudaimonic aspects of well-being towards self-improvement. And I really like this idiom from Chinese philosophy, which a friend of mine working at the Singaporean ministry tried to help me understand that, a key kind of philosophy that is lived by in their part of the world is the idea that you must first taste the bitter and then the sweet. So this idea of delayed gratification, we're going to be working perhaps at school on things that are challenging and difficult, but actually the reward in the end might be that we accomplish that milestone, or we grasp that learning, whatever that may be. So just to showcase that there are different perspectives of well-being and what it means. And I also wanted to, of course, not overlook the current context that we see ourselves in around the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a huge impact on children's well-being, and indeed it's really brought this discussion of, what are the goals of education to the fore of our minds. So now that we've got an understanding of well-being and what it is, what does it actually matter to educators? Well, my kind of positionality, again, where I'm coming from, is that educators don't need to justify well-being as being important. If we question why are we on this planet, what is the meaning of life, I would argue that feeling content, fulfilled, and having a sense of purpose is a worthwhile educational aim in and of itself. So actually teaching what it means to lead a meaningful life is, doesn't need any justification. But if we were to take that a step further and think a bit more about the outcomes of well-being, perhaps, we can see in research, and indeed some of these references are from research internationally, we can see that higher well-being has been associated with higher attainment, and it's also positively linked to self-confidence, having a growth mindset, and holding mastery approach goals, which in turn have been linked to higher achievement. So there are particular adaptive outcomes academically that are linked to having experiencing high well-being, and the flip is also true. So lower well-being has been associated with an increased risk of underachievement and also school dropout. And again, we can see that behavioural difficulties are also more likely to occur when children do not experience high life satisfaction, high well-being in the context of school. So I hope this just underlines why we're having this discussion today, why well-being. All right, I am hoping that we can make this a little bit interactive today. So my colleague Kate is going to help me with this. We've got a poll for you. So I wondered if you could indicate in the poll, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being very important, 3 being somewhat important, and 5 being very important, what importance is given to children's well-being as a way of understanding their learning in your country? So I'll just invite Kate to share that poll. Excellent. Thank you, Kate. All right, so how important is children's well-being in your country, specifically in relation to their learning? It's great to see so many people here today. Where are we coming from around the world? Pakistan, Brunei, hello. Tanzania, welcome. Exeter, UK, hi. Somebody here from Cambridge as well. Brilliant, welcome everyone. All right, I'll just give it a couple of more minutes for you to vote. Hi, from Ghana, excellent, hello. I'm so pleased that there's so many of us from all around the world. Okay, I'm just going to give it 10 more seconds just to give me a flavour of, where you're coming from. Is well-being something that is thought about quite deeply in your own context in relation to learning, or not so much? Okay, I think we'll close the poll there then, Kate, if that's okay. Just to give me an idea of where we are. So it looked like the responses there were very much kind of earing towards, yeah, it's somewhat important, but perhaps not given as much attention as perhaps it should be. So let's continue with our workshop, just bearing that in mind then, that it's quite interesting, we're coming at this from different understandings. I hope that by the end of today, you perhaps feel equipped to speak to your colleagues and anybody that you'd like to convince about well-being having importance. All right, so just to wrap up this section then, I'm just looking here at a common theory of well-being that's provided by Martin Seligman. Seligman is one of the founding fathers of positive psychology. He's an American psychologist. And as you can see here, he proposes the PERMA model of well-being. So he purports that there are 5 pillars of well-being. We've got positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. And I wonder if you could just take 5 seconds to look at those pillars and just reflect to yourself, which of these do you think might be most important to our discussion today? Thinking about metacognition in particular. All right, so that was just a little reflection for yourself there. I think that when we're looking at Seligman's model here, clearly metacognition, the process of thinking about one's thinking, where you are in your learning, where you want to go, the strategies that you need to adopt in order to get there, I think that's going to involve emotions. I think that's going to involve feelings of difficulty, of uncertainty, perhaps. And we need to be able to remain optimistic about one's previous learning, present learning, and future goals. We're also engaged. We're engaged in activities and in a state of flow when we're thinking about our learning and learning. And of course, metacognition, the whole purpose behind it is that we're able to regulate our learning and strive towards those end goals, whether they be in the formative sense, at the end of the lesson, I will know X, or if it's more in the summative sense, so perhaps mastering content in a particular module. Okay, so one of the theories we're going to be drawing on today is Carol Dweck's theory of self. Now, Dweck, has been well known for her theory of growth mindset, but perhaps her original theory of self, is one that's less understood or perhaps less talked about in the educational space. My work is interested in how different psychological traits that people hold actually mediate the relationship between well-being and achievement and the processes therein. So this is where we're going in the next part of the workshop. Okay, so Dweck's theory of self then. It is a cognition affect behavior model. So this very simply means that our thinking affects how we feel, which in turn has a resulting behavior. So if we're thinking about the school context, we might think about learners reflecting on their thinking, reflecting on their learning, the various emotions that might be conjured up through that process, some of them very difficult emotions, and the resulting behavior. Perhaps they're going to put their hands up in class, they're going to be engaging, perhaps they're going to be withdrawn and actually disengaged. But what Dweck argued is that individuals hold implicit theories about ourselves. Now, this involves everything that we make up, right? So we have either a fixed or a growth mindset. I should point out, however, that research that's been conducted within the past few years has actually shown that it's less dichotomous than we would first have seen in her earlier work. So actually, we don't just hold a fixed or just hold a growth mindset. There's a kind of merging of the two. So these beliefs can become enmeshed. But for the purposes of today, let's think about fixed and growth mindsets. So the mindsets that we adopt actually are related not only to our cognitive abilities, so whether I see my cognitive ability or intelligence, that's not a word that we like to use in education, so I prefer ability. But say I had a fixed mindset, I had implicit beliefs that I was not capable of changing my ability, whether that's in maths, in reading. Actually, my ability is fixed, it's static, it's incapable of growth. Whereas growth, on the other hand, as the name implies, you believe that your abilities are incremental and they can change over time. Now, what I want to emphasize here is in Dweck's original theory of self, she doesn't just talk about cognitive ability. She actually talks about the permutation of mindset throughout the different layers of our psyche. So we're not just thinking about how we think about our ability cognitively. This also extends to how we feel about our emotions. Am I capable of feeling happier? Is my happiness something that is capable of expansion, development, growth? What about my relationships? Are my relationships fixed in a negative cycle? Is it possible for me to cultivate more loving, kind friendships, relationships in my life? So these mindsets, in turn, according to Dweck, relate to specific experiences of emotion. So in her research, Dweck found that children who hold fixed mindset tend to experience more anger, anxiety, shame, and helplessness in the classroom, whereas children who adopt more of a growth mindset, they're more flexible in how they think about themselves, they have greater confidence, and they experience more happiness and satisfaction overall. I'd also like to introduce the idea of approach goals. So I'm a social psychologist, so I believe that every behavior that we see in the classroom is a result of mindset, of emotion and motivation. So there's a motivation driving a behavior. There's a motivation driving whether a child puts their hand up or not, whether they are being disruptive in the classroom. And the approach goals framework can be quite useful for thinking about this. Avoidance approach goals pertain to when a child is avoiding appearing incompetent in the classroom. So then they're disengaging because they don't want to appear stupid or perhaps unknowledgeable. Whereas mastery approach goals is the motivation for children to engage in learning for the sheer pleasure of it, because they want to expand their knowledge, their abilities. And performance approach goals refer to when children want to outperform others, to compete with others. And they approach goals seem to, in terms of the different profiles of learner, they seem to be adopted by different profiles of learner. So you can look at the research on this if you're interested, but I just wanted to highlight theory of self is a really useful tool for us to think about how thinking, emotions and behaviour in the classroom are related. But let's extend this a little bit further. I'd like to give you just 30 seconds to read this quote for me. Okay, so those two learners that Getty is describing there, you would probably likely infer that one of them knows the answer and the other does not. But what if I asked you, did they experience the same feelings of certainty or uncertainty? And how did those feelings guide their behavior? So somebody who's putting their hand up and offering a response, another who appears to look blankly and doesn't know. So I think we ought to kind of consider the emotional experiences that underpin children's engagement in the classroom. We can take this a step further. I would argue that metacognition and emotion are inseparable experiences. If we just think about this on a basic level, you know, the process of evaluating my thinking, my learning, I'm thinking, you know, what does success look like? Well, you know, it ought to be this, I ought to be here, and instead I'm somewhere else. So metacognition is being aware of and in control of your own thinking. And just as a reminder, there are two different aspects of metacognition. There's metacognitive knowledge, which is our understanding of strategies, how we're going to get to the next stage, or of our own ability. And metacognitive regulation, our ability to monitor what we're doing, evaluate our progress, and adapt as necessary. Now, I would argue that underpinning metacognition is the assumption that we are capable of changing our thoughts and actually being the master of our learning, which in turn lends itself to a growth mindset. Because in order to believe that we're capable of growth and to engage in metacognition, then we must have this implicit assumption. So there are various ways of thinking about this. But essentially, just as a reminder, it's, you know, metacognition is a process of thinking where you become aware of your own behavior and thoughts. And there is an inseparable relationship between cognition and affect. So in her handbook of self-regulation and control, Patricia Alexander says that feelings of happiness and pride, coupled with a sense of personal responsibility, can lead to renewed efforts and higher aspirations. Conversely, shame, depression, anxiety, particularly when people feel that certain factors are beyond their control, can lead to the adoption of self-destructive strategies such as task avoidance and withdrawal. Okay, so that's Patricia Alexander, a leading expert in self-regulation and metacognition, underlining the importance of emotions. And a common concept in metacognitive research is the idea of the inner voice. And the inner voice has feelings, or at least this is what I would argue. In other words, how learners feel about themselves before, during, and after their performance influences their self-regulatory engagement. So the process of self-regulation refers to an inner voice or a teacher that is inside of every learner that they need to harness. And more than that, as teachers, you are helping your pupils cultivate an inner voice, a teacher, a guide within them. And that voice is not unfeeling, right? There can be difficulties associated with that voice. If that voice is telling me you're not where you need to be, you need to focus, you know, what about this spelling? What about the feedback that Sir's just given you or Miss has just given you? So there is an affective experience that we can't deny. And in research, we've seen that learners' ability to regulate their emotions is related in turn to how well they process information and ultimately learn. So hopefully I've highlighted that learners are not robots. And I mentioned a couple of times feelings that might be uncomfortable. So feelings of certainty or uncertainty, feelings of difficulty, feeling that we are not good enough, perhaps. I would argue that these can actually be adaptive and they're all part of the metacognitive process. In this piece of research that was conducted with young children, they found that young children as young as 3 were able to introspect on their level of uncertainty about a learning task and then decide, based on my level of uncertainty, I'm going to either ask for help, I'm going to try the task again, or I'm going to choose not to answer. So in other words, feelings of uncertainty and uncertainty monitoring, which is a process of monitoring your emotions, is associated with metacognitive control. And furthermore, feelings of difficulty are also important metacognitive experiences, which research has shown provide information, critical information, about the abilities that are required of me, of myself, to complete a task. Where am I? How do I feel about that? And what am I going to need to do? All right then, so we've got another poll that Kate's going to put up for us. So I'd like you to think about your own practice now. We're kind of doing a gear change, which I mentioned at the beginning. I'd like you to think about your own practice, and I'm asking you to think about the emotions that learners might experience when they make objective progress in their learning. And apologies, we're not going to do a poll. I've misunderstood there. We are going to do a bit of a collaboration board. So I think Kate can help us with that, but we're going to be using a platform called Padlet. So it's an interactive board we're going to use to think about some emotions now. So I'm just going to stop sharing so that we can go over there. Thank you, Kate. And I think we've got a link to share with you as well, so you can have access to this. So that is the link to the Padlet. Hopefully that gives everybody access. So if you wouldn't mind, what I would like us to do first of all is, you can see on the left-hand side of the board, we've got emotions associated with learning. On the right-hand side of the board, we've got emotions associated with learning progress. So if you wouldn't mind just using the right hand, oh, sorry, I didn't show you how to do this. 1 second, I've got a little, let me show you how to use Padlet. Sorry, everyone. Oh, have I added that in there? I don't seem to have added it in there. That's frustrating. Right. Sorry, everyone. Let me show you how to use Padlet. So perhaps if I share my screen again and go over to Padlet. Here we go. So on Padlet, you can just click here. You can write an emotion that you might associate with learning. So I'm going to put the most obvious, well, perhaps not the most obvious one, actually. Perhaps this is going to be a bit of a tricky one, but you can then connect it to, so we're just going to create a little mind map there. I'm going to delete my one, because what do I know? Thank you. Somebody's already started. I can see there's lots of people collaborating. Thank you for being so open to doing this. Excellent. I'm going to just stop sharing my screen there. So lots of different, okay, that's great. And you've already started engaging with the emotions that are associated with learning setbacks and challenges, and also emotions that are associated with learning progress. So let's have a look at this. Satisfaction, encouraged, surprised, happy, proud. Thank you. On the other hand, we've got disappointment, a feeling of anxiousness. Embarrassment is a very big one. Yes, thank you for that. Pride, scared, fear. Yes. Yeah, worried. Thank you. There is a sense of doubt, of disappointment. Absolutely. I think these are critical. And actually, what we don't want to do is, hopefully, as I've shown in our, in our lecture there, we don't want to kind of diminish negative experiences, because they can actually be very, very adaptive and useful for metacognition. If we feel uncertain, if we feel perhaps, slightly disappointed in where we are, then that can be used as fuel to kind of guide us and get us back on track. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. You can see there the myriad of different emotional experiences that we've got. I'm just kind of, trying to move them around and showcase all of your thinking. Thank you ever so much. That is great. All right, triumphant. I like that. All right, so I'm just going to share my screen again so we can go back. But really, that exercise was just for us to just have a bit of an experiment, really, and think about this in a bit more depth, about the range of different emotional experiences that are associated with learning when we think critically about this. So now that we've kind of covered the main content of the session, I'd like us to try and apply these theories of metacognition and wellbeing to your own practice. Thank you to whoever it was that actually wrote a little comment on the Padlet there. You said, you know, what can I do to cultivate learner wellbeing in my environment, in my classroom? So we're gonna come to that. Thank you very much for asking. So just wanted to remind you of theory of self. So taking a step back, we're thinking about thinking, feeling, and behaviour. We're thinking about the mindsets that pupils might adopt, the related affective experiences, and the motivational goals that actually guide their learning. So thinking about theory of self, would you mind just posting your reflections in the chat? I'm going to give you a few minutes to do this, but my question to you is, to what extent does Dweck's theory of self reflect your experiences as a teacher? Are there any aspects of theory of self that you can see in your own practice? I'm just going to stop sharing so I can see your comments in the chat. Wow, it's wonderful to be joined by so many today. 129 of us, 130, excellent. If I'm positive, my students are positive. I think that teachers play a critical role in setting a tone, an emotional tone and a precedence, and indeed modelling mindset to your students. If I give positive feedback, students feel confident. Absolutely, thank you, Fiona. Yeah, and how we give feedback as well is really important, isn't it? The language we use. It's okay to make mistakes, of course. Yeah, actually we can learn from mistakes. Anna said, I love the idea that the teacher is helping the child to cultivate their inner voice. Yeah, and we've got inner voices as well. I think we forget that as adults. Modelling a growth mindset. Thank you, Hilary, for sharing your insights from your subject domain there in music. Performance approach is very much a goal for those with a growth mindset. I can imagine it is. And perhaps, you know, research has shown a certain amount of healthy competition can be adaptive. I think we just need to keep an eye on when it kind of verges into being debilitating, perhaps. Mercy said, when learners, moving really quickly, when they feel aware of their well-being, they are more open to learning and making mistakes. Thank you, Mercy. Okay, thank you, everyone. Well, I hope that you might bear in mind theory of self as a way of understanding your learners. I do appreciate that you're not psychologists. I'm not asking you to, you know, be clinicians and try to understand every single child in your class, but perhaps understanding the governing framework of theory of self and how all of those thoughts and emotions are associated. All right, so we're going to have a bit more interaction now, and what we're going to do is we're sticking with the gear that we're in. So we're in third gear, or you know, whatever you want to call it, but we're in our practitioner shoes now. We're thinking about what we would do as a teacher, what you would do as a teacher. And I'm going to present to you two case studies. So these are fictional learners, though they are based on some of my own experiences. And I'm going to introduce you to the learner. And then I would like you to think about how you would support that learner to engage in more metacognitive strategies, bearing in mind everything that we have learned today. So I'd just like to introduce you to Eden. Eden is 12. She is conscientious and high aspiring, and her parents also have ambitious expectations for her learning. Eden is enthusiastic and frequently answers questions in maths, but the level of confidence is not necessarily matched with that accuracy, right? So I'm sure you can imagine somebody in your own class who is a bit like this. She often offers ill-developed answers that have not been fully considered, okay? So lots of enthusiasm, but perhaps the reflection and the inner dialogue, am I sure about this? You know, she's not quite got a handle on her gauge of, you know, the extent to which she might be right before she puts her hand up. And sadly, when her answers are then met with, actually, that's not quite right, Eden, but thank you very much, she will then express disappointment, frustration, and embarrassment, and she kind of wears it externally. So she's not internalizing this. It's very clear to everybody in the class that Eden's feeling disappointed about that. So my question is, how do you as a teacher help Eden and encourage her to use metacognitive strategies in her learning? So I'm just going to reverse. I'm going to reverse for you back to Eden. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to reflect, and then I'm going to stop sharing and we'll have a conversation in the chat. So what would you do? All right, so what would you do to encourage Eden to use metacognitive strategies in her learning? Let's have a look in the chat. So what do people think? Yeah, remind Eden making mistakes is part of learning. Give all students a minute to reflect on their answers. Individual whiteboards are a great tool. Thank you, Anna. Yeah, making notes as they go along. Peer discussion, making use of peers, absolutely. Peers are a great mirror, aren't they, to check your learning. Am I on the right track here? Oh, they've thought of something quite different to me. Maybe I'm not quite right. Absolutely. Asking how did she reach? So I just want to go back to that comment. Manisha, thanks ever so much for that. Asking Eden, how did you get that answer? How did you reach that answer? Backtracking through how she arrived there and engaging her in that critical reflection. Okay, everyone, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen again and offer a couple of pointers, but you've already covered many of these. So I'd say, first of all, we do need to continue to praise Eden for engaging in the lesson, because, you know, it's really important that we reinforce ideas of growth. Just because she didn't get it this time doesn't mean that she'll not get it next time. Somebody mentioned this in the chat. So we want to mitigate shame or embarrassment. We can use post-lesson exit cards, or in my teaching, what I call muddiest points. So I do this with undergraduate students as well, but it's allowing all learners to engage in a process of reflection in their learning. You've probably done this already, so I won't bore you with that, but basically allowing you to address critical gaps in their knowledge at the beginning of the next lesson. You might also use reflective prompts in their exercise books, perhaps at the end of the lesson. Before the lesson, I thought this. Now I think this. And then ask them, how has your thinking about atoms, or whatever it is that's been covered in the lesson, changed? And finally, emphasize to Eden and to the whole class, and this is something that was mentioned in the keynote actually, the idea of stop and think. So we're emphasizing that internal learning, what's happening inside, and that inner voice, is as valuable as externalized thinking. And we want to model inhibitory control strategies in the maths context so that Eden knows it's okay, you don't need to be shown to be engaging all the time. I know that the deep learning, you know, that's happening within you might not be externalized, basically. Because there is this performativity culture, and it might be that actually putting Eden at ease and emphasizing that's quite important. Okay, let's move on to a slightly younger learner. So I'd like to introduce you to Zaya, who is 7. Zaya is quiet and reserved. She enjoys reading, and in recent English tests, she's demonstrated a secure comprehension. So she's doing very well, but she prefers not to read aloud in class, and she rarely raises her hand or offers answers. Overall, you've observed that Zaya is quite cautious and she lacks that self-belief. So what would you do as a teacher to help Zaya? just going to reverse again, give you some seconds to reflect. So slightly different to Eden. Eden had a lot of enthusiasm. She was not, worried about engaging and being shown to participate in class. Eden is much, much more shy, okay? But she's doing really well, but she's not quite engaging with the lesson. So what would you do to encourage Eden to use metacognitive strategies in her learning? Let's have a look in the chat, see what you think. Oh, we've already got lots of answers. Okay, I'll try and engage her in a group discussion. Thank you, Norrin, for continuing to post your reflections on the first case study. I really appreciate that. It's good to see that people are reflecting on these. So with regards to Zaya, Kingsley has said, I would put in a measure to help Zaya boost her self-confidence, especially in public. Okay, yeah. Think, pair, share. Nika has suggested we do think, pair, share in a small group. I think that would be great, yeah. So we're not, we need to respect that learners have their own unique personalities, and we don't want to force Zaya into, suddenly becoming more like Eden or, something like this, but actually respecting and meeting learners where they are. And that's why I think, pair, share is actually a great strategy, because we're encouraging Zaya in a small group context to engage with others and externalize her internal thinking. She's clearly, doing very well. But yeah, put her in a group activity, assign a role for her. I love that. Encouraging her by giving her opportunities. Retell, excellent. Thanks so much, everybody. Gosh, just such rich answers. Snowballing instead of ping-ponging. Imrana, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, but I mean, that sounds interesting. Please feel free to expand in the chat so that people can learn from your experience. Okay, all right, I'm just doing a quick time check. Excellent, right. So I'm just going to share my pointers for Zaya. We're going to do a roundup of the lecture, and then we are going to go to a Q&A. So Zaya. Many of these you've already mentioned. So if she feels comfortable, you could invite Zaya, if you've not already, to share her answers with the class. Perhaps if this is a positive first experience and you reward her engagement with high praise, she might be more inclined to offer an answer again in the future. However, even if Zaya doesn't speak up, you might comment on her learning progress and offer praise on an individual level, just so she's still getting that feedback. You could implement learning journals. These have been shown to be particularly helpful for shy or withdrawn learners, and this allows them to reflect on their learning goals regularly, to facilitate metacognitive regulation, and to build metacognitive knowledge. And just while we're on this, actually, I mentioned in my last slide about Eden, about the exit cards, the muddiest point. If you were really very brave, and I do appreciate this is not an easy thing to do, you could ask your learners to couple, so they write what they're uncertain about, the question that remains unanswered at the end of your lesson. And then in another colour, you could ask them to write one emotion that reflects their current learning experience. And as you're flicking through, that should allow you to get a flavour of how the class overall is feeling. And as we know, emotions guide learning experiences and can hinder or support metacognition. So you might do that. And you can also, following on from the learning journals, rather than have that as a standalone activity that's never seen again, you could integrate that into the lesson and actually invite learners to share reflections on strategies that have worked well for them with the class, if they feel comfortable again. So just to reiterate, I'm not suggesting that shy learners should be made to integrate into, an extroverted classroom, because that's not for everyone. And I think that's very important to acknowledge. But perhaps some ways to elicit the learning that is taking place, the reflection and the thinking that Zaya is engaging with. is going to be important. Okay, so we're coming to the end of the kind of the lecture content, if you will. Just some further suggestions for teaching practice, if you don't mind. So I am very much an advocate of whole school approaches to wellbeing. If you read any of my research, hopefully that'll be clear. But I just wanted to underline, even though today we've thought about wellbeing in quite a contextualized way, we've been thinking about metacognition, I would argue that actually the whole principle underpinning today's lecture is that we need school environments that have an ethic of care, that are compassionate, and actually see wellbeing and learning as experiences that go hand in hand. So we need senior leaders to lead the way with this. At an individual teacher level, you could use traffic light systems to gauge mood and check in. That's another way of doing that with your class. I'm also a fan of psychoeducation, so you could even take it a step further if you have the time in your curriculum, curriculum, everybody laughed, you know, those two things don't go hand in hand nowadays, but I believe that we should be teaching learners what it means to see themselves as subject to change, of capable of development. So I think actually teaching mindset and traits like this are really important. You can rehearse an incremental mindset yourself, you know, show that you are a human. Oh, you know, class, I was reflecting today about, you know, a situation at a friend of mine, and, you know, actually, I think I'm going to try a different strategy there because, you know, that doesn't seem to be quite working for me. And, you know, relationships as well as, you know, our learning as well, we are the masters of those situations. So it's up to us to kind of try new strategies. You can use continuous formative assessment, which regularly sets specific learning goals with your students and helps them regulate that inner voice by externalizing the internal. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. We're going to move on to a Q&A. Just very quickly, if you would like to get in contact with me about anything, my email address is there on the screen. I've also got Twitter, although I'm not sure how I feel about Twitter, if I'm honest. And if you're interested in reading any of my research, you can find it all for free on ResearchGate. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to answering some of your questions.